Welcome back to the channel and to our Volkswagen diesel-powered Chevy S10 project. Today, we're going to go down the rabbit hole and have a look at how the cold start and the timing advance mechanism works on the BOSCH VE injector pump. Now, this is definitely the last thing I want to do today. You see, fiddling with an injector pump is not fun, but I have good reason to suspect that there may be problems with the injector pump on our Volkswagen engine, and if that's the case, then we're definitely not getting the full performance from the little diesel engine. But before we get elbow deep into something that's very complicated, we first need to fully understand how the cold start and the timing advance works on the BOSCH VE pump. So I went ahead and picked up a used and very questionable injector pump that we can use to learn with. So the plan is to take this pump apart, replace all the seals, and if that goes well, we can install it in the truck. Well, that was the plan. It turns out this pump is completely seized, and I spent the next 3 hours trying to disassemble the pump without breaking anything. Now, disassembling a seized pump is not the subject for today's video, so we won't get into that. However, I will show you some snapshots of some interesting things I found inside this pump throughout this video. The good news is I was able to completely disassemble the pump, then clean up all the junk inside of it, and then reassemble the pump. The bad news is, well, this pump is NFG, and that's because it has some pitting on some of the rotating surfaces. That sucks, but now I can use this pump to demonstrate what to look for and how the cold start and the advance system works. Furthermore, from what I learned by fiddling with this old pump, now I can do a quick diagnosis on the injector pump that's currently installed in the truck. That way, we can quickly determine if the pump needs to be removed and repaired. Alright, let's start over. So this is the used and damaged pump that we'll use in order to understand how the cold start and the advance mechanism works and what can be done to possibly repair the pump that has a non-functional cold start system. Now keep in mind, if the cold start feature is not working on your pump, well, you may not really care, but it's extremely possible the timing advance mechanism also doesn't work. You see, the two systems are mechanically linked, and if the timing advance is not working, then your engine's definitely not running to its full potential. So this BOSCH VE pump is used on a lot of engines, and it's not just for Volkswagen diesels. Now, if you don't have a background in diesels, that's fine. You see, the way this pump works is pretty much the same as a distributor on a gasoline engine. But instead of distributing sparks to the spark plugs, this distributes fuel to the injectors. And just like on older distributors, this guy has an advance mechanism in it. So, as you may know, on a gasser engine, if your ignition advance is not working, then you're not getting the full power from your engine. This chunky guy is pretty much the same as a distributor cap on a gasoline engine, and inside this guy is a rotating shaft which kinda acts like the rotor under the distributor cap. Of course, the difference is this is distributing fuel instead of spark. Now, what makes the BOSCH VE pump different than the inline pumps that are found on a lot of other diesel engines is, on the VE pump, there's only one plunger delivering the metered fuel, whereas on an inline pump, there are multiple plungers. For instance, on this Kubota 3-cylinder diesel engine with an inline pump, it has 3 plungers, one for each cylinder. On an inline pump, each plunger needs to be calibrated to deliver the same amount of fuel to each cylinder. So that's why working on an inline pump takes special calibration equipment. Now, since the VE pump has one plunger that feeds all the cylinders, well, as long as the swash plate, the plunger, and the distributor head are in good condition, then all the cylinders will get fed an equal amount of fuel. And there's no calibration required to equalize the fuel being delivered to each of the cylinders. That's the quick explanation. Now, the bottom line is, it's possible for a regular person to completely disassemble and reassemble a VE pump, but you have to pay attention to the way the pump was originally assembled. The setup on these pumps is tailored to the specific engine that they were used on, and in this case, this was set up for a Volkswagen 1.6-liter diesel engine. Now here's a great example. The throttle arm on the top of this pump is indexed to the shaft. This throttle arm can fit the shaft a dozen different ways, and it's important to photograph the relationship between the center of the throttle shaft to the index marks on the throttle arm. This has to be reassembled exactly the same way. Now on the cold start lever, you also have index marks, and they need to be photographed for proper reassembly. The idle screw and the max throttle position screws don't need to be touched, but if for some reason you want to remove them, then you need to use a caliper to measure the length of these screws, so they can be installed exactly the same way. The amount of protrusion on the governor shaft needs to be recorded so it can be reassembled exactly the same. Now, the fuel screw is another item that needs to be reassembled exactly the way it came out. This screw makes the biggest difference, and the good news is it's possible to leave it in place, but measure it anyway, just in case. So right now, I'm sure you figured out that a caliper is needed to work on these pumps. These things are cheap, and most people have one in their toolbox these days. So it turns out there are some specialized tools that are required to work on these pumps, and you need a special socket to remove this screw and this screw. Now, when I disassembled this pump, I didn't have the special sockets, and I made something that sort of worked. I definitely recommend buying a kit like this if you plan on working on a VE pump. Now, this kit was only $25 from Amazon, and at the time this video was being recorded, I still didn't have the specialized sockets, but they're on their way because they're definitely needed. Okay, let's have a look at the cold start side of the pump. Now, this pump has the high idle feature for cold start, and this linkage will put pressure on the throttle when the cold start lever is activated. This high idle feature is not found on all pumps, and as a matter of fact, the pump on the truck doesn't have this feature. Now, keep in mind, this pump is now fully functional as far as the cold start and the advance mechanism goes. The rest of the pump may be foobar, but at least the stuff that we're interested in does work. So here's a quick way to tell if you have a problem with the cold start and the timing advance system. When the cold start lever is pulled slightly, it'll bounce right back. Now inside this pump, there's a huge spring, and that's what puts pressure on the cold start lever. And if you get bounce back, then the cold start linkage inside the pump is moving freely. Since the cold start and the timing advance are directly connected, chances are the timing advance is working correctly too. If that's the case for you, then you're dismissed and have a good rest of your day. Now, if you don't get bounce back, well, that means the timing advance piston is stuck in the bore, and that ain't good. Stick around and I'll show you how it all works and possibly how to fix it. So let me pull this cover off, and you can see the big spring that I mentioned a few moments ago, and you'll be able to see the piston move when I activate the cold start lever. Okay, this is the spring that pushes on the timing advance piston or plunger back into its resting position. Now, from what I've seen on forums and YouTube videos, there's supposed to be 3 shims inside this pump, and I only count 2. Now, that may be normal, or it means the pump was modified. One of the tricks people do is remove one of the shims, and that will theoretically change the advance curve and possibly improve performance. Now, that's definitely something future Jimbo's going to experiment with, but first we need a working pump. Anyway, when I activate the cold start lever, you can see the piston or plunger move. Now, inside the body of the pump, there's a bunch of stuff going on, and I'll show you how all that works real soon. So now that we removed the big spring, you can see that there's no bounce back on the cold start lever. Obviously, that's because we removed the spring. However, in a different situation where the spring was still present and we didn't get bounce back, that would mean the piston or plunger is stuck in the bore. Now on this pump, that was one of the things I discovered when I took it apart. The piston or plunger was stuck solid due to old contaminated fuel. Now it may be possible to unstick the piston without any further disassembly. I don't have a lot of experience to know if that's truly possible. In theory, you may be able to tap the piston back into the pump, perhaps use some kind of penetrating oil to lubricate the piston. The important thing to remember is, if you try something like that, well, the cold start lever needs to be in place. You see, the cold start lever will keep the internal linkages from moving too far and possibly damaging the pump. So in theory, tapping this piston back a little bit and then using the cold start lever to move it in the other direction may help unstick piston. It seems like that would work, but you have to be real careful not to use too much force. Now, if you do use too much force, I'll show you what will get damaged when I open up the pump in a few moments. Now here's something I need to mention. The inside of this pump is normally completely filled with diesel fuel, and the fuel is what keeps this pump lubricated. Contaminated fuel can cause a lot of problems because the pump relies on clean fuel to stay lubricated. So moving the cold start lever slightly and getting bounce back is a good indicator that the advance mechanism inside the pump is free to move. Now, another way to find out if the advance mechanism is stuck is when you're setting the timing on the injector pump with a dial indicator. Alright, well, the pump is obviously not installed on an engine, but I can still show you how the dial indicator will move when the cold start lever is activated. If this pump was on the engine and we were setting the timing with the dial indicator, the manual tells you to make sure the cold start lever is in the off position. So use your imagination, and in this example, we're all set up to check the height of the plunger. When I pull on the cold start lever, that'll change the reading on the dial indicator like so. Now on the truck, when I tried this a few weeks ago, well, I didn't see a change on the dial indicator, and that's when I realized that we may have a problem with the injector pump. The engine still ran fine, but I was compelled to get a second pump to verify what I saw was actually a real problem. My original plan was to rebuild this pump with all new seals, but it turns out the pump is basically scrap metal, but it's a good teaching aid. So today we're going to stay focused on the cold start lever and the timing advance mechanism, so let's go ahead and take this pump apart and have a better look. So of course I've already measured and photographed everything that needs to be put back exactly the way I found it. Since this pump is foobar, I'll be using power tools to speed everything up. Hand tools are probably a better choice on a pump you want to use again. Oh, and this pump doesn't have any O-rings in it. You know, they were all in bad shape and I didn't want to use any fresh O-rings when I put it back together for today's video. Now, today's video is not an instruction guide on how to repair and reassemble a pump. Nope, we're just going to have a look at how the various parts work inside this pump. Now, despite the fact that I originally videoed every aspect of disassembling this pump previously, well, I used another video on YouTube that someone else published to reassemble this pump. I'll put a link in the video description, and it's pretty much a slideshow with text, but it was the perfect amount of information to reassemble the pump. Okay, now I can remove the top cover. In order to get this cover off, the throttle shaft needs to be pushed completely through. You know, there just isn't enough room between the pump cover and the pump body to disconnect the internal throttle linkage, and this is the only way to get inside the pump. Since this pump also has a high idle feature, we're going to need to disconnect another spring that's under the cover. Now, this linkage can be disconnected by pulling on the spring and twisting the linkage slightly, and it pops right out. Okay, now we're inside the pump and we can see most of the gizzards. Unfortunately, in order to get to the advance mechanism, we need to dig a lot deeper. I reckon this governor doohickey needs to come out in order to open up some more space. The shaft that holds the governor in also sets the RPM which the governor will start cutting fuel. So before removing this shaft, it needs to be measured with a caliper so it can be reinstalled exactly the same way. And this is the governor. It's a pretty clever mechanism. This lever is a continuation of the throttle linkage, and now we need to pull it out. Now this guy is held in by two screws that require a special socket to remove, and I don't have the sockets yet. The good news is, when I reassembled this pump yesterday, I only finger tightened these screws. I'm probably doing this in the wrong order. I really should have loosened the distributor head first, but no worries, the distributor head is the next part to come out. So this shaft both rotates and moves in and out. When it rotates, there are grooves that will line up with whatever cylinder is going to get a shot of fuel, and when it moves in and out, that motion is what pumps the shot of fuel into the injector circuit. In this section of the pump, the fuel is under extremely high pressure. Now, according to the internet, a pump like this can generate well over 2000 psi. However, the injectors are going to pop well before that. So when an injector pops, that's when the pressure is high enough to overcome the heavy-duty spring inside the injector, and at that point the atomized fuel will flow into the pre-chamber on the engine. Now this thingy is called the cam plate. Not much to say other than it's in our way right now. Okay, at this point I can actually show you how the advance mechanism works. So a few things to keep in mind. First of all, this cavity is supposed to be completely filled with diesel fuel. Now, the pressure of the fuel inside the cavity varies depending on the speed of the engine. At idle, well, there ain't a lot of pressure inside here. However, as the engine speeds up, so does the pressure. And when the fuel pressure rises, it's going to act on the spring and plunger that controls the advance mechanism, and it'll move this whole assembly. So basically, the injector pump advance mechanism is hydraulic, and it works off the fuel pressure that's developed by the rotary vane pump that's buried under all this stuff. We'll take a look at that pump in a few minutes. Now, to help a cold engine start faster, you have the cold start linkage, and this will mechanically advance the pump about 4 degrees. So the cold start lever advances the pump a tiny amount, and when the fuel pressure rises, the hydraulic pressure takes over and continues to advance the injector pump timing. So earlier in the video, I showed you how the cold start lever will spring backwards if the plunger is free to move. And if the plunger gets stuck, there's no spring back. Well, in the case of a stuck plunger, the advance mechanism will not work. The injector pump timing could get stuck at 4 degrees advance, or it could get stuck at full advance. In either case, you lose the variable timing feature that was engineered for best performance. This shaft is what connects this gizmo to the advance plunger. Now, the movement I'm showing is exaggerated because I'm able to move the plunger a little bit more than it normally moves. Keep in mind, when this plunger is forced to go beyond its limits, this shaft will come in contact with the pump body. The point is, if you use a hammer to try to unstick the plunger, you'll end up damaging the body of the pump. So if excessive force is required, this shaft needs to be removed first to avoid serious pump damage. We'll get into how to remove it in a few moments, but first we have to remove a few more parts. Okay, now I can remove the shaft. Right now there's a spring clip that's in the way, and we need to pop that guy off. Now you can see the little pin that was hiding under the spring clip, and with a pair of tweezers I can pull it out. Next, I can slide the shaft out of the way. At this point, the plunger can be removed from the pump body. Now, if the plunger is stuck, it's safe to use a little extra force. But if a reasonable amount of force can't get it to move and you end up using a 10-pound hammer, then chances are the pump is foobar. And this is the plunger. One of the parts fell under the platform. Hang on. So this is the side of the plunger that the cold start lever contacts with, and this is the side of the plunger where the big spring goes. The whole thing sort of looks like this, and that's what advances the injector pump timing. This plunger appears to be in decent condition, and it now moves freely inside the pump. I reckon if the rest of the pump was good, we would have a decent pump. Anyway, let's take a look at the rotary vane pump that generates the fuel pressure that's used to advance the pump timing. This plate needs to come off, and it's held in with 2 Phillips head screws. Alright, this is the rotary vane pump. Now this guy is also the lift pump, and it's what's used to draw the fuel from the fuel tank. Now if this rotary vane pump is not strong enough to move the fuel from the tank to the pump, then you got some problems. Now some people end up using an electric lift pump to feed the injector pump because this pump is worn out. That works, but it also means the rotary vane pump is likely not building enough internal pressure for the advance mechanism to work properly. You know, for this project, I would prefer everything worked as designed. However, for some folks, as long as the engine still runs, well, there's no need to worry about the pump failing, and using an electric lift pump to feed this pump is definitely a way to keep the engine running. And finally, here's a close-up shot of the cold start lever and the plunger, and as you can see, the cold start lever imposes a slight amount of mechanical movement on the plunger. Well, that's a big mess. The good news is putting this back together is not that difficult since all the parts are right here on the cookie tray. As I mentioned earlier, there's another video that someone else published that shows how this all goes back together in a step-by-step process, and I put a link to that video in the description. Well, I reckon it's time to apply our newfound knowledge and do a quick diagnosis on the truck. If my suspicions are correct, then the injector pump has a seized plunger that controls the timing advance. So this is the cold start lever on the side of the injector pump. It's sort of hard to see, but here it is. Now the cold start gizmo is activated by pulling up on this doohickey that's mounted to the floor of the truck. Obviously there's a lot of friction in the cable, and doing this doesn't give me a good feel if the cold start lever is bouncing back. So I'm going to have to disconnect this cable and then use a pick to activate the cold start lever. Fast forward a few minutes and the cable has been disconnected, and now I can manually move the cold start lever. Well, it looks like we don't have any bounce back. So it looks like we have a confirmed case of stuck plungeritis, and we'll need to do a plungerectomy. Despite the fact that this is bad news, it's very satisfying to be able to do a simple diagnostic while the pump is still installed. Had I not experimented with the pump on the bench, I wouldn't have known this for sure. So this engine only has 150 or 160,000 miles on it. But keep in mind, the engine sat for about 12 years prior to us putting it in a truck. Now, about 2 years ago when we acquired this engine, it was in a rusted out 1985 Volkswagen Golf. After some basic maintenance, which included a new timing belt, we got the engine running again. And as soon as the vital signs were stable, we immediately gave it a concentrated diesel purge enema. It's hard to say if the diesel purge had any effect. The fuel going in and out of the injector pump remained the same color, and it didn't seem like any of the gunk was getting dislodged. Overall, the engine ran great, and there was no reason to suspect the injector pump was having issues. Of course, at the time, we didn't play with the cold start lever. So the inside of the pump that we just fiddled with on the bench looked like this. And if you don't know, this is pretty much immaculate. However, that's after we cleaned the pump to make it look pretty for the video. You see, the pump looked like this before it was cleaned, and that's just nasty. But hold on, you see, before we even attempted to disassemble the dirty and seized up injector pump, we ran a mixture of diesel fuel and automatic transmission fluid through the pump. Right here you can see the little fuel pump that's drawing fuel from this container and pumping it through the injector pump and back into the container. The fuel control solenoid was confirmed to be working and it was energized during this procedure. We let the electric pump run for about an hour, then we let the injector pump sit for 2 days before we attempted to disassemble it. So going back to this picture, it's hard to say if the diesel fuel and the ATF mix had any effect as far as cleaning the pump, because we don't know what it looked like prior to running the hodgepodge mix through it. Now what I do know is, the plunger for the timing advance was still stuck solid, and the segments in the rotary vane pump were also stuck. I think it's safe to say that the diesel fuel and the ATF mix had little or no effect. So, in order to clean the pump, I used denatured alcohol and a paintbrush, and I just rubbed the alcohol onto the areas that were tarnished. Then I used a nylon brush to scrub the surface. In my opinion, something this dirty is not going to respond to a simple chemical treatment. Anyway, the injector pump that's currently on the truck has a confirmed stuck timing advance plunger, and the best course of action is to remove the pump, disassemble it, and unstick the plunger. I have absolutely no fear of doing that, and I look forward to digging into the pump. We have a rare opportunity to try a few experiments in the name of science and the betterment of mankind. We can do another concentrated diesel purge enema, and we can also try doing a seafoam enema. Now, seafoam is definitely not mainstream for injector pump cleaning, but there are folks on the internet who have used it in the same way diesel purge is used. Just in case you're not aware of how to do a diesel purge enema, basically, we run the supply line and a return line from the injector pump to an alternative fuel container, just like we did when we resurrected this engine a few years ago. We start the engine on pure diesel fuel, and then we add the diesel purge chemical to the container. Now, with the engine running, some of the mix will get consumed immediately, and the rest of the mix will get sent back to the container through the return line. The mixture is going to be able to pick up heat from the injector pump, and the warm mixture should have some kind of magical effect. Eventually, the concentrated mix will get fully consumed by the engine. However, halfway through the procedure, it's recommended that the engine be shut off and allow for some time to allow the elixir to possibly dissolve some of the smegma inside the injector pump. Anyway, using automotive pharmaceuticals is likely a waste of time, and the pump needs to come off and be disassembled. However, we have the opportunity to experiment, and I love experiments. So, instead of pulling the pump and doing the right thing, we're going to do a diesel purge and a seafoam enema, and if by some miracle this treatment unsticks the plunger for the timing advance mechanism, then that would certainly be useful information for a lot of viewers. One way or another, we're going to repair this injector pump. Unfortunately, that's going to take a lot more time than we have this week, and you'll need to tune in next week to find out what we discover. This week's video was a lot longer than normal, and I did that as a gift for my viewers. And as a bonus, on Christmas Day, we'll arrive at a random viewer's house and force them to watch this video in its entirety. People have been asking for longer videos, and now you have one. Plus, one lucky person will be forced to watch it no matter what. For everybody else, I would like to wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. We'll see you next time. Until then.